In 1893, in the ancient mound of Nippur in southern Iraq, archaeologists lifted a clay tablet from the earth that had remained buried for nearly 4,000 years. The tablet was fragmentary, its edges broken, about the size of an adult palm. Its surface was covered in wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform script pressed into wet clay before it hardened under the Mesopotamian sun. When scholars finally translated it decades later, they found something unexpected. The text wasn't a myth or a hymn, it was a record of what happened after the flood swept over, a record of what the gods said, and more specifically, a record of what they did next. The tablet, catalogued as CBS 1673 and now housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains portions of what we call the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood narrative. But unlike the stories you may have heard before, this text doesn't focus on the flood itself. It focuses on what came after, on the transition, on the moment when kingship descended from heaven again, as the text states, but differently this time. The antediluvian world, the world before the flood, had operated under one system. The post-diluvian world would operate under another. And here's what makes this tablet remarkable. It was preserved not by accident, but by intention. Sumerian priests copied this text. They taught it in scribal schools. They archived it alongside administrative records, legal documents, and astronomical observations. They treated it not as entertainment, but as institutional memory, as if something had happened that required documentation, as if a message had been delivered that needed preservation across generations. Tonight, we're going to examine what that message was, what Sumerian priests recorded about the departure of the Anunnaki, the divine assembly that, according to these texts, once governed directly, but then withdrew. We'll look at actual tablets with catalogue numbers and museum locations. We'll read what the texts actually say, not what popularizers claim they say, and we'll explore a question that mainstream scholarship tends to sidestep. What if these weren't myths about gods, but preserved memories of a transition from one kind of civilization to another, from divine governance to human autonomy, from dependence to inheritance? If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, perhaps in bed, perhaps in a favourite chair, take a moment to comment where you're hearing this from. It helps us understand this community we're building together, exploring these ancient mysteries in the calm of evening. The tablet from Nippur sits in its climate-controlled case now, behind glass. Its surface shows the marks of the reed stylus that pressed each sign into the clay. Someone made this. Someone who believed what they were recording mattered enough to preserve. Someone who served as a witness to something that had already become history. And across dozens of other tablets, from different cities and different centuries, the same pattern emerges. Instructions, lamentations, king lists, temple catalogues, wisdom texts, all pointing to the same threshold moment, all describing the same transition. Before we can understand what the priests recorded, we need to understand who they were, why they kept records, how they viewed their role, and what kind of civilization would task its religious class with preserving technical knowledge alongside sacred texts. The architecture of memory. The Sumerian scribal school, the Adaba, literally tablet house, was not primarily a religious institution. It was an archive, a repository, a training ground for the administrative class that would run civilization. Young scribes spent years learning hundreds of cuneiform signs, copying standardized texts, practicing mathematical calculations. They learned to read and write in both Sumerian and Akkadian. They studied legal precedents, medical procedures, astronomical observations, and yes, the ancient stories, but not as separate categories. To the Sumerian mind, these were all aspects of the same thing, knowledge that must be preserved. When we excavate the tablet houses of ancient Nippur, and Uruk, We find them organised with remarkable precision. Administrative tablets in one section, records of grain distribution, labour assignments, tax receipts, technical tablets in another, mathematical tables, survey measurements, astronomical calculations, literary tablets in a third, the epic narratives, hymns and wisdom texts. But here's what's crucial. They're all stored together. They're all treated with the same archival care. The instructions of Shuruppak, a wisdom text from around 2600 BC, sits alongside agricultural yield calculations. The Sumerian king list, which chronicles rulers from before and after the flood, is preserved on the same four-sided prism format used for administrative king chronicles. This tells us something important. The Sumerians didn't distinguish between history and mythology the way we do. They had one category: records, things that happened, things that needed to be known, things that must not be forgotten. Consider the instructions of Shuruppak, found in multiple copies across different sites and time periods. The text presents itself as advice from King Shuruppak to his sons Yasudra, the Sumerian Noah, the flood survivor. The instructions are practical: how to plough a field, how to settle disputes, how to choose a wife, how to conduct oneself in the assembly. These aren't abstract moral principles, they're operational guidelines, procedural knowledge. The text reads like a manual for running a civilization without constant divine oversight. One passage instructs, you should not buy a donkey that brays, it will split your midriff. You should not locate a field on a road, your share will be lost. Practical advice about asset management and property rights. Another section, you should not make a well in your field, people will cause damage on it for you. Infrastructure planning, risk assessment. These are the concerns of autonomous decision makers, not servants awaiting divine instruction for every choice. But then the text shifts. It discusses proper behaviour toward the gods, proper respect, proper offerings, but notably, it doesn't suggest the gods will personally intervene in daily decisions. The gods occupy a separate sphere. They establish the order. They set the system in motion. But the day-to-day operation, that's human responsibility now. The instructions of Shuruppak exist in copies spanning 1,000 years. Scribes in different cities, different dynasties, kept recopying this text, teaching it, preserving it. Why? What made it worth the enormous labour of hand copying onto clay tablets? Remember, this is before mass production. Each tablet required shaping clay, inscribing while wet, drying or firing for permanence. This was expensive, time-consuming, done only for knowledge deemed essential. The scribal curriculum tells us what a civilization values, what it believes the next generation must know, and the Sumerian curriculum included, alongside mathematics and law, texts that described a world before the flood where things worked differently, where divine kings ruled for impossibly long reigns, where the Anunnaki, the divine assembly, decreed fates directly. And then, after the flood, a new system, shorter-lived human kings, autonomous city-states, priestly intermediaries rather than divine presence. At Nippur, archaeologists found standardized textbooks, copies of the same texts used across different scribal schools. The consistency is striking. A student in Ur would learn the same creation accounts, the same king lists, the same wisdom instructions as a student in Uruk or Babylon. This wasn't accidental variation, this was curriculum. Institutional knowledge deemed non-negotiable. Among these standard texts, the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian king list, the temple hymns, the lamentation texts, all describing, from different angles, the same transition, the same before and after, the same sense that something fundamental had changed in how civilization operated. But there's something else in these archives, something that appears again and again in the colophons, the signature blocks at the end of tablets. Scribes identified themselves not just by name, but by lineage, by temple affiliation, by priestly family. The scribal class and the priestly class were often the same people. The keepers of secular knowledge and sacred knowledge were identical. The record keepers of history and the record keepers of divine instruction were one institution. This matters because it means the people preserving accounts of grain distribution were the same people preserving accounts of divine assembly proceedings. They used the same verification standards for both, the same archival practices, the same sense that this was memory, not fiction, record, not entertainment. When excavators opened the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 19th century, they found thousands of tablets carefully organised and catalogued. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king of the 7th century B, had ordered scribes to copy and collect texts from across Mesopotamia. His library included ancient Sumerian works translated into Akkadian, often with both languages preserved in parallel columns. The colophons on these tablets are revealing. They often state, written according to its original, collated and checked. This is archival language. Authentication language, the language of people treating these texts as verified documentation, not creative literature. Among Ashurbanipal's collection, multiple copies of the Atrahasis epic, which describes the creation of humanity and the flood, multiple copies of the Adapa myth, which describes one of the 7 antediluvian sages who brought knowledge to humanity, the Enuma Elish creation epic, temple inventories, ritual procedures, all preserved together, all authenticated, all treated as knowledge that must not be lost. This archive-minded culture, this obsessive preservation, created a problem for us, a problem of interpretation. When a civilization carefully preserves accounts of divine councils, of gods walking among humans, of impossibly long-lived antediluvian kings, of a catastrophic flood, of a fundamental reorganization of cosmic governance, and preserves these accounts using the same documentary standards they use for verified historical records, what do we do with that? Do we dismiss it entirely as mythology? Do we accept it literally? Or do we ask a different question? What kind of historical memory might be preserved in texts the record keepers themselves treated as memory? The Sumerians built their civilization on the bank of the Euphrates River in what is now southern Iraq. By 4000 BC, they had developed writing, monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, urban planning, legal codes, schools, and a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy. They created the world's first literature, first laws, first cities, and they credited all of this explicitly, repeatedly, in tablet after tablet to instruction from the Anunnaki, the divine assembly who came from heaven, who established kingship, who taught civilization. And then, according to these same carefully preserved records, the Anunnaki withdrew. Not suddenly, not in a single event, but in a transition marked by the flood, a transition from direct governance to delegated authority, from constant presence to remote oversight, from dependence to inheritance. The texts describe this transition from multiple angles: king lists that show a change in reign lengths, lamentation texts that describe gods abandoning their temples, wisdom literature that teaches autonomous decision-making, temple inventories that catalogue the institutions left behind, and creation texts that explain humanity's original purpose and what happened when that purpose changed. Taken together, these texts, preserved across centuries, copied and recopied by scribes who saw their work as archival duty, form a pattern that suggests the Sumerian priesthood was preserving something they believed to be true, a memory of transformation, a record of what was said and done before the transformation became complete. What was that message? What did the priests record as the final instructions before divine withdrawal? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when, according to the texts, the system was first established, when kingship descended from heaven. In the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University sits one of the most remarkable objects to survive from the ancient world. It's called the Weld Blundell Prism, catalogue number WB444. It's a clay prism about 8 inches tall with 4 flat sides, each covered in neat columns of cuneiform script. The text inscribed on this prism dates to approximately 1817 BC, though it records events claimed to span hundreds of thousands of years. This is the Sumerian king list. The text begins with a statement that has puzzled scholars since its first translation. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not after humans invented kingship, not after people organised into hierarchies, after kingship descended from heaven, as if it came from somewhere else, as if it was given, not developed. The king list then proceeds to name the antediluvian rulers, the kings who reigned before the flood, 8 kings in 5 cities, and their reign lengths are staggering. Alulim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years, Alaujar ruled for 36,000 years, and Menluana ruled in Bad Tabira for 43,200 years. The numbers continue in this pattern, reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Mainstream scholarship treats these numbers as purely mythological, symbolic, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals. And that's a reasonable interpretation. Except for one detail, the text doesn't present them differently than it presents later, verified historical kings. The same prism that gives Alulim a 28,800 year reign gives Gilgamesh of Uruk a 126 year reign. The same documentary format, the same king by king accounting, the same transition formulas. Then City X fell and the kingship was taken to City Y. After listing the 8 antediluvian kings, the text contains a single crucial line, then the flood swept over. What follows is a different pattern entirely. Post-flood kings have reign lengths in human scale, decades, occasionally a century or so, which might be dynastic accounting or exaggeration, but nothing like the antediluvian numbers. The first king after the flood, Gushur, ruled in Kish for 1,200 years, still superhuman, but notably shorter than 28,800. His successor rules for 960 years, then 670 years. The numbers are coming down. By the time we reach historically verified periods in the late 3rd millennium BC, reign lengths match archaeological evidence. The text has transitioned from one kind of accounting to another. But here's what matters for our investigation. The king list treats the flood as a historical boundary, a transition point, after which the system of kingship changed. The text literally states that after the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven again, as if it had existed before, was interrupted, and was then re-established. But differently this time. Different cities, different kings, different reign lengths, different rules. Other king list versions are even more explicit. An old Babylonian version from Uruk, catalogued as W2037, lists not just the antediluvian kings, but also their corresponding Upkalu, their sages or advisors. 7 Upkalus served the 8 kings. These Upkalu have Sumerian names, meaning things like builder and bond of heaven and earth. They're described in other texts as the ones who taught civilization to humanity, who brought the me, the divine decrees or principles that govern reality, who established the temples, the rituals, the sacred cities. And crucially, the Apkallu tradition ends at the flood. After the flood, there are no more Apkallu, no more divine sages teaching directly. Instead, there are human priests, human scribes, human administrators of the systems the Apkallu established. The pattern is transition from direct divine instruction to inherited knowledge, from presence to memory, from dependence to autonomy. Multiple Mesopotamian texts mark the flood as this transition point. The Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, Tablet C of the Gilgamesh epic all describe the flood as the moment when the relationship between gods and humans fundamentally changed. Before the flood, gods walked among humans, issued direct commands, solved problems, made decisions. After the flood, gods withdrew to their temples, communicated through signs and omens, required priestly intermediaries, left humans to govern themselves within the established framework. The Sumerian king list preserves this transition in the stark language of administrative documentation. Before, 8 kings, impossibly long reigns, divine oversight, after human-scale kings, autonomous city-states, priestly administration. The list doesn't explain why this changed. It doesn't moralise about it. It simply records, this is how it was, then the flood, then this is how it became. When we find the same text preserved across multiple sites, Nippur, Isin, Lhasa, Babylon, when we find it copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, included in the standard scribal curriculum, we have to ask, why did they preserve this? What function did it serve? One possibility, it served as institutional memory, a record of how the current system came to be, an explanation for why civilization operates through human agents rather than divine intervention, why priests interpret signs rather than receive direct commands, why kings rule with delegated authority rather than as incarnate gods. It's a charter, in other words, documentation of a transfer of authority from direct divine rule to human governance under divine framework, from dependence to inheritance, from childhood to maturity. And if we read it that way, as preserved institutional memory rather than pure mythology, then the details start to matter, the locations, the names, the sequence, because these become the documentation trail, the record of where authority was transferred to whom, under what circumstances. Eridu, the first city listed, was considered the most ancient of Sumerian cities. Its temple to Enki, god of wisdom and water, was believed to be the first temple ever built. Archaeological excavations at Tel Abu Shirain, the site of ancient Eridu, found temple structures built and rebuilt on the same spot across millennia, each new temple carefully constructed directly over the foundation of the previous one. 17 layers of temples, one atop another, spanning from the Ubaid period around 5000 BCE into historical times. Continuous sacred occupation for thousands of years. The Eridu temple archaeology matches the king list chronology. The oldest settlement layers at Eridu date to before the development of writing, before cylinder seals, before the first dynasty of Egypt. If the Sumerians wanted to point to where civilization began, Eridu was the logical choice, not because of myth, but because of visible, excavatable fact. The king list claims the first king, Alulim, ruled at Eridu. That kingship itself began there, descended from heaven there. And if we set aside the superhuman reign lengths for a moment and ask what historical memory might be preserved, we get something interesting. A tradition that institutional authority, kingship, priesthood, temple, city, originated the oldest known Sumerian settlement and then spread to other cities in sequence. Bad Tibera, the second city listed, where 3 of the antediluvian kings reigned. Archaeological site, Tel al-Madinah. Excavations limited, but pottery and tablet finds confirmed Sumerian occupation into the 3rd millennium BCE. The site sits on an ancient branch of the Euphrates, positioned for trade and agriculture. Lerag, the 3rd city. Modern Tel as-Senkere, Sumerian city dedicated to the sun god Utu. Excavated tablets confirm its importance in the early Sumerian period. Sippar and Shurupuk, the remaining antediluvian cities, both confirmed archaeologically, both with temple complexes, both with continuous occupation across the periods the king list describes. These aren't imaginary places, they're real cities with excavatable remains. The king list preserves a geography of real locations and claims these were the 5 cities where divine kingship was established before the flood. 5 centres of early civilization. 5 points where, according to the memory preserved by priests, authority descended from heaven and was administered through human-divine collaboration. Then the flood, and after, a different set of cities, Kish, Uruk, the great cities of the early dynastic period whose archaeology is well established, whose kings left actual inscriptions, whose reigns can be verified through multiple sources. The king list preserves a 2-phase system, an older, more mysterious phase where the rules were different, and a newer, historical phase operating under the system we can verify, with the flood marking the boundary between them. And here's where it becomes relevant to our investigation. The flood is also where the instruction literature intensifies, where the wisdom texts appear, where we find tablets explicitly teaching humans how to operate independently. The instructions of Shurupak, the text we discussed earlier, comes from Shurupak, the last antediluvian city in the king list. The text presents itself as instruction from the last antediluvian king to his son, who will survive the flood. It's structured as preparation, as transfer of essential knowledge before a transition, before a separation. If we were documenting the handoff of an institution, a government, a business, a temple complex, what would we include? Operational procedures, lists of assets and responsibilities, instructions for maintaining systems, contact protocols, conflict resolution procedures, exactly what we find in the Sumerian corpus of instructional and administrative texts that proliferate after the flood date. The Sumerian king list isn't just a curious document about impossible reign lengths. It's a structural map of transition, a before and after statement, a marker saying, here is when the old system operated, here is where it changed, here is the new system. And the transition point is documented, preserved, taught to every generation of scribes. Why would you preserve this unless you believed it documented something real, something that explained how your civilization came to operate the way it does, unless it was institutional memory of actual transition? The priests who copied the king list over and over weren't telling bedtime stories. They were preserving the foundational document of their civilization's governmental system, the charter that explained why human kings ruled with priestly oversight rather than as direct incarnations of divine will, why priests interpreted divine will rather than simply transmitting it, why autonomy had been granted. And if kingship descended from heaven once, and then descended again after the flood, but differently, then something was communicated at that transition, some message, some set of instructions, some handoff of responsibility. What was that message? To understand it, we need to look at why humans were created in the first place, according to these texts, what role they were supposed to play, and what happened when that role changed, the burden that was lifted. The British Museum holds thousands of cuneiform tablets in its collection, among them a baked clay tablet with the catalogue number K3375. It's part of a set of fragments that together preserve the old Babylonian version of the Atrahasis epic, dated to approximately 1700 BCE, but recording a story the Sumerians believed to be far older. The Atrahasis epic explains why humans exist. The text begins not with humanity, but with divine labour disputes. Long ago, according to the epic, the Anunnaki, the great gods, forced the Igigi, the lesser gods, to do physical labour, digging canals, dredging rivers, clearing land, agricultural work, infrastructure projects, the labour of civilization building. The text describes this work in detail. They were carrying the work baskets. Their work baskets were huge. They were digging the watercourses. They were clearing the canals. They were establishing life for the land. For 40 years, the text specifies the lesser gods did this work under the supervision of Enlil, the god of storms and executive authority. Then rebellion. The Igigi gods threw down their tools. They burned their work baskets. They marched by night to Enlil's temple and surrounded it. The text records their complaint. Every one of us has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. What follows is a divine council meeting. Enlil is furious at the rebellion. He wants to punish the Igigi. But Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, the god of wisdom, proposes a different solution. Create a new being to do the work. A being neither fully divine nor fully animal. A hybrid. a worker. The text then describes the creation of humans with remarkable precision. Enki instructs the mother goddess Ninmah to mix clay with the blood of a slain god, one of the rebel leaders. The divine blood provides consciousness, understanding, the ability to follow instructions. The clay provides physical form. The result? Lulu Amilu, the primitive worker, humanity. The text explicitly states the purpose. Let him bear the load of the gods. Let them be freed of the work. Humanity was created to perform the physical labour of maintaining civilization so the gods could focus on governance, planning, cosmic maintenance. This is theology, yes, but it's theology with an operational structure. It describes a system, divine beings in administrative roles, human beings in physical labour roles, a clear hierarchy with defined responsibilities, and this system, according to multiple texts, worked for generations. Humans multiplied, they built cities, they maintained irrigation systems, they harvested crops, they made offerings at temples, the gods oversaw, directed, received their due. The system functioned. But then something changed. The Atrahasis epic continues. Humanity multiplied too successfully. They became noisy, disruptive. The text uses the Akkadian word huburu, an uproar, a clamour. The land became wide, the people became numerous. The land was bellowing like wild oxen. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise. He addressed the great gods. Enlil's solution: reduce the population. He sends plague, then drought, then famine. Each time Enki helps humanity survive by teaching them countermeasures, medical knowledge for plague, irrigation techniques for drought, fishing and alternative food sources for famine. Finally, Enlil decrees a flood, a complete reset. The divine council agrees with one dissenter. Enki warns Atrahasis, the human survivor whose name means exceedingly wise. He instructs him to build a boat, preserve seed stock, save his family and craftsmen. The text is specific about what to preserve: all the animals of the field, all the birds of the sky, breeding pairs, genetic diversity, agricultural knowledge, the foundation for rebuilding. The flood comes. The text describes it vividly. The Anunnaki raised torches. They lit up the land with their glow. The stillness brought by Adad passed over the sky. Whatever was bright turned dark. The waters rise. Humanity is destroyed. But here's where it becomes relevant to our investigation. After the flood, the system changes. Atrahasis emerges from the boat. He makes offerings. The gods who haven't received offerings during the flood gather around the sacrifice like flies, the text says. They're hungry. They've missed the human contribution. They realise they need humanity as much as humanity needs them. A new agreement is established. The text is fragmentary here, but we can piece together what happens from multiple sources. The Eridu Genesis, another Sumerian flood narrative, states, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Note the phrasing, descended from heaven, again, as if it's being re-established, as if the pre-flood system is being restored, but with modifications. The modifications matter. In the post-flood system, humans are no longer simply workers. They're administrators, they're kings, they're priests, they're scribes. They maintain the civilization infrastructure, yes, but they also make decisions. They govern, they interpret, they operate with autonomy. The gods, meanwhile, withdraw from direct oversight. They remain present in their temples. They communicate through signs, omens, dreams. They receive offerings and provide favour, but they don't walk the streets directing daily operations. That responsibility has been delegated. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets at the British Museum, makes this transition explicit. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the world, he addresses the divine assembly about creating humanity. Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage, man shall be his name. Truly, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. But then, crucially, After humanity is created and set to work, Tablet the 7 describes Marduk receiving 50 names. Each name represents an aspect of divine authority being concentrated in him as mediating figure between the divine realm and the human world. The many gods who once interacted directly with humanity are consolidated into a single bureaucratic structure, one god as executive, one point of contact, one source of instruction. This is organizational streamlining, administrative restructuring, the transition from micromanagement to delegated authority. And if this was institutional memory of an actual transition from one system of civilization management to another, then there must have been instructions, protocols, training, a handoff period. That's what we find in the next set of texts. Explicit instructions for operating civilization, not for pleasing gods or performing rituals. Those instructions existed before, but instructions for autonomous decision-making, for solving problems without divine intervention, for maintaining systems without constant supervision. Instructions, in other words, for what to do after the gods withdrew. Instructions written on clay. The University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology houses multiple copies of one of the oldest wisdom texts in human history. These tablets, excavated from Nippur and other Sumerian sites, preserve a text called the Instructions of Shuruppak, dating to approximately 2600 B in its earliest known form. The text exists in multiple versions across a 1,000-year span, suggesting it remained part of the standard scribal curriculum throughout the Sumerian and Old Babylonian periods. The text presents itself as advice from Shuruppak, the last antediluvian king, to his son Ziusudra, the Sumerian name for the flood hero we know from later Akkadian sources as Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. The framing is significant. This is instruction from the last king of the old world to the first survivor of the new world, from the ending system to the beginning one, from father to son across the flood boundary. The content is remarkably practical. My son, let me give you instructions, may you pay attention. Ziusudra, let me speak a word to you, may you pay attention. Do not neglect my instructions. Do not transgress the words I speak. What follows is not theology, it's operational procedure. Do not buy a donkey that brays, it will split your midriff. Asset evaluation, quality control. You should not locate a field on a road, your share will be lost. Property rights, infrastructure planning. You should not make a well in your field, people will cause damage on it for you. Risk assessment, security planning. You should not vouch for someone, that man will have a hold on you. Financial liability, legal responsibility. These aren't spiritual principles, they're management guidelines. The kind of knowledge you'd pass to someone who is about to run a civilization without your direct oversight. The text continues with social instructions. You should not utter improper speech. Later it will lay a trap for you. Diplomatic protocol. Reputation management. You should not pass judgment when you drink beer. Decision-making procedures. When to deliberate. When to abstain. You should not steal anything. You should not break into a house. Do not desire silver. Legal code. Property ethics. But notice what's missing: divine punishment for violations. The text doesn't say do not steal or the gods will curse you. It says do not steal because it's bad practice, because it undermines social stability, because autonomous civilization requires voluntary adherence to order. The instructions proceed systematically through domains of responsibility. Agriculture. You should not cut down a date palm and plant a garden. It will not produce profit for you. Resource management. Long-term planning versus short-term gain. The date palm takes years to mature and produce. The garden produces quickly but doesn't build lasting infrastructure. This is teaching delayed gratification. Investment thinking. Capital versus consumption. Trade. You should not hire somebody and then have a quarrel with him in the street. Labour relations. Public reputation. The principle that disputes should be private and solutions should be formalised through proper channels, not aired publicly. Governance. You should not select a quarrelsome man as your companion in a dispute. Conflict resolution. Choose advisors wisely. Avoid escalation. Family. You should not marry a prostitute. She will not be loyal to you in the gatehouse. Social stability. Long-term relationship assessment. The gatehouse was where public business was conducted. The text is teaching that partners should be reliable in public-facing roles. What's striking is how comprehensive the instructions are. Agriculture, trade, governance, family, property, finance, social relations, reputation management, conflict resolution. These are the domains of civilization operation. The text is teaching someone how to run society, not how to please gods, but how to manage the practical functions of organized human life. One section focuses on speech and wisdom. You should not use obscene language, otherwise it creates hatred for you. You should not speak arrogantly, otherwise your words will come back to haunt you. You should not boast. Your words will be trusted more. These are lessons in credibility management, in building institutional trust, in conducting yourself as an authority figure whose words must be believed and followed. The kind of instruction you'd give to someone about to assume leadership without your presence to back them up. Another section addresses generosity and reciprocity. Do not ignore your share for someone who will have no share. You should not locate the share of your God's estate in the estate of your neighbour. Economic boundaries, fair distribution, recognition that resources are finite and must be managed carefully. The text also includes what we might call epistemological instruction, teaching about knowledge itself. You should not speak too quickly. Later on, it may come back as a trap. You should not speak falsely. It will be a crime against you. A liar's mouth makes his God angry. Here we see the transition. Earlier sections taught autonomous decision-making without invoking divine consequences, but embedded throughout are reminders that gods exist, that they care about human conduct, that they reward justice and punish disorder. The system isn't godless, it's God-supervised rather than God-operated. The gods set the framework, humans operate within it. Violations bring consequences, but those consequences come through natural social breakdown or eventual divine reckoning, not immediate intervention. This is the theology of delegated authority. The gods are present but distant, invested but not micromanaging. They care about outcomes, justice, order, productivity, social stability, but humans determine the means. One of the most revealing passages concerns decision-making in the assembly. You should not sit in a public place while hostility surrounds you. Do not make a judgment in the public assembly without consulting your God first. Consult your God. Not receive a command, consult. Seek wisdom, consider divine principles, but then make the judgment yourself in the public assembly as a human authority exercising delegated power. This is training for governance after divine withdrawal. The text teaches how to make decisions using divine principles as framework, but human judgment as executive function. How to maintain order without constant divine intervention. How to solve problems independently while remaining aligned with cosmic order. Multiple copies of the instructions of Shurupak exist because it was standard curriculum. Students at the Aduba, the tablet house, would copy this text as part of their training. They'd memorize it, internalize it. And then, as they graduated into roles as administrators, judges, temple managers, estate supervisors, they'd apply these principles. They'd operate as autonomous agents within the established framework. This is what inheritance looks like. Not just receiving temples and cities and irrigation systems, but receiving the knowledge to maintain them, the wisdom to operate them, the principles to govern by. And the framing of the text, from Shurupak to Ziusudra, from pre-flood king to flood survivor, suggests the Sumerians understood this as transitional knowledge, as what needed to be preserved across the boundary between one system and another, as the final instructions before the old order gave way to the new. But the instructions of Shurupak weren't the only wisdom literature preserved, and they weren't the only text framing knowledge, as inheritance from divine sources, there was an older tradition, a tradition of 7 sages who brought all knowledge to humanity before the flood. And their story provides another angle on what the final message might have been, the 7 who taught civilization. The British Museum's collection includes fragments of tablets from Tel El Amarna in Egypt, dated to the 14th century BC, preserving an Akkadian version of the Adapa myth. Additional copies exist from the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh from the 7th century BC. The story these tablets tell is one of the most intriguing in Mesopotamian literature because it explicitly addresses the transfer of knowledge from divine sources to humanity. Adapa was the first of the Apkallu, the 7 sages of Sumerian tradition. His name means he who knows. He was created by Ea-Enki, the god of wisdom, and endowed with tremendous understanding. The text describes him as wide-eared, meaning comprehensively knowledgeable. He understood the secrets of heaven and earth. He could read the divine tablet of destinies. He knew the arts of civilization. But according to the myth, Adapa was mortal. The story preserved in the Amarna tablets describes Adapa fishing in the Persian Gulf when the south wind capsized his boat. In anger, Adapa broke the wing of the south wind, a metaphorical act representing mastery over natural forces through knowledge. This caught the attention of Anu, the supreme god, who summoned Adapa to heaven to explain himself. Before Adapa ascends, Ea gives him crucial instructions. When offered the bread of life and water of life in heaven, refuse them. There'll be death, not immortality. Ea is protecting his creation from what he believes is a divine trap. But when Adapa reaches heaven, Anu is impressed by his wisdom. As a reward, Anu offers Adapa eternal life, the bread and water of immortality. But remembering Ea's instruction, Adapa refuses. He chooses mortality. He returns to earth as the wisest of humans, but condemned to die like all humans. The text ends with Adapa establishing the priesthood, teaching the sacred arts, instructing humanity in the proper conduct of temple service. He becomes the model priest, the exemplar of wisdom, but mortal, limited. This story has traditionally been read as a Mesopotamian version of the fall, humanity's loss of immortality through a fateful choice. And that's certainly one layer. But there's another reading that matters for our investigation. Adapa wasn't offered immortality as a gift. He was offered it as a test, a choice. Stay with the gods and live forever, or return to humanity and teach what you know, even though it means accepting death. Adapa chose teaching. He chose inheritance. He chose to transfer knowledge to humanity even at the cost of his own immortality. And he wasn't alone. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, preserved Mesopotamian traditions about the Apkallu. He called them the 7 sages and described them as beings who emerged from the sea, from Dilmun, the mythological paradise, the abode of the gods, and taught humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, architecture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, ritual, everything needed for organized society. Berossus' account states that these teachings occurred before the flood. After the flood, there were no more Apkallu. Instead, there were human sages who carried on the knowledge the Apkallu had taught. Multiple Mesopotamian texts preserve lists of the 7 Apkallu by name. Uan the knowledgeable, Uanduga, the bond of heaven and earth, Emmeduga, he whose me is supreme, Emmegalama, born of me, Emmebuluga, he who understands me, and Enlilda Anu's shepherd, Utwabzu, he who descended from heaven. These names are titles as much as personal names. They describe functions, roles, relationships to divine knowledge. The me mentioned in several names is the Sumerian term for divine principles or decrees, the fundamental laws governing reality. The Apkallu were those who understood these principles and transmitted them. The tradition explicitly dates them to the antediluvian period. They served as advisors to the 8 kings listed in the Sumerian king list. Each king had his corresponding sage. The relationship was collaborative, divine king with divine sage, administering human civilization according to cosmic principles. Then the flood, and after the flood, the tradition changes. Post-flood texts don't mention Apkallu. Instead, they mention human scholars, human priests, human sages who study the knowledge the Apkallu taught, but don't receive direct divine instruction. The Apkallu tradition is the Sumerian account of how humanity learned civilization, not through gradual trial and error, not through evolutionary social development, through instruction, through teaching, through knowledge transfer from beings who already possessed comprehensive understanding. Whether we interpret this as mythology, as metaphor for gradual learning, or as preserved memory of some kind of cultural transmission, the pattern is clear. The Sumerians believed their civilization was inherited, not invented. They believed the knowledge that made cities, temples, irrigation, writing, law, and medicine possible came from a specific source, and that source predated the flood. After the flood, that direct source was no longer available. The Apkallu were gone, but their teachings remained, preserved in texts, encoded in practices, embedded in institutions. This is the architecture of inheritance. You don't inherit only physical assets, temples, cities, fields. You inherit knowledge, procedures, principles, the accumulated wisdom that makes the assets functional. And the Apkallu tradition suggests this inheritance was intentional. These weren't gods who accidentally left knowledge behind. They were teachers who systematically transferred understanding, who ensured humanity could maintain what had been built, who prepared for their own absence. One text from the library of Ashurbanipal, a ritual incantation series called Bitmazeri, describes the Apkallu's function. They established the plans of heaven and earth. They made the me excellent. They performed the rituals. They gave advice and instruction. Past tense. Completed action. They did this once. It's done. Now it's humanity's responsibility to maintain it. Another text, part of the series of priestly lamentations, describes the post-flood situation. The ancient Apkallu are no more. There are no longer any who emerge from the sea. The bond of heaven and earth has been loosened. Now human wisdom must suffice. The bond of heaven and earth has been loosened, not broken, not severed, loosened, as in the connection still exists, but operates differently now, less direct, more mediated, requiring human agency to maintain rather than divine presence to ensure. This is the theology of transition, from direct instruction to inherited knowledge, from divine teachers present among humans to divine principles encoded in human institutions, from dependence to responsibility, and it aligns precisely with what we see in the archaeological record. Sumerian civilization appears with remarkable sophistication in the 4th millennium BC, full writing system, complex mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, urban planning, monumental architecture, legal codes. These don't develop gradually over millennia. They appear in mature form. Archaeologists explain this through cultural diffusion, borrowing from neighbouring regions, rapid development during the Uruk period, all reasonable explanations. But the Sumerians themselves explained it differently. They said they were taught by the Apkallu before the flood. Whether that's literal or metaphorical, the claim is the same. This knowledge is inheritance. It came from somewhere. It was preserved. It must be maintained. And if the Apkallu were the teachers before the flood, and if the flood marked their departure, then their final message would have been, here's everything you need. Now it's yours. Maintain it. Govern yourselves. We're withdrawing our direct presence, but the systems remain. The principles remain. The knowledge remains. That's not abandonment. That's graduation. But inheritance creates obligation. If the temples, the cities, the irrigation systems, the legal codes, the astronomical knowledge, the medical procedures, if all of this was given, not invented, then it must be maintained, honoured, used properly, and the gods, though no longer directly present, remain invested in whether humanity upholds its end of the arrangement. That's what the next set of texts addresses. What happens when the arrangement breaks down, when the inherited systems aren't maintained, when divine withdrawal threatens to become divine abandonment. The Assembly's decision. Among the tablets excavated from ancient Mesopotamian sites, a particular genre stands out for its theological sophistication: creation epics. These texts weren't simply origin stories for entertainment. They were ritual texts, recited during New Year festivals, used in temple dedications, taught in scribal schools. They explained how the current cosmic order came to be and who had authority to maintain it. The most famous of these is the Anu, named after its opening words, "when on high." 7 tablets, Neo-Assyrian copies from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Original composition dated to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BC. The British Museum houses the primary copies. The epic describes cosmogony, the origin of the cosmos itself. In the beginning there was only Apsu, the freshwater deep, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea. These primordial forces mingled their waters, and from them emerged the first gods. These gods were noisy, disruptive. Apsu wanted to destroy them to restore peace. Tiamat initially resisted. The younger gods learned of Apsu's plan. Enlil killed Apsu and established his dwelling in the depths. This triggered Tiamat's revenge. She created monsters, an army led by her consort Kingu, and went to war against the younger gods. The gods were terrified. None could stand against Tiamat, until Marduk, son of Ea, offered to fight her, but only if the gods would grant him supreme authority. The divine assembly agreed. They gave him executive power, all authority consolidated in one figure. Marduk defeated Tiamat, split her corpse, and from her body created the heavens and earth. He organized the cosmos, assigned positions to the stars, established the calendar, set the moon and sun in their courses, created order from chaos. But then he faced a problem. The gods who had granted him authority expected him to provide for them. They wanted rest. They wanted to be relieved of the burden of maintaining the physical infrastructure of the cosmos. Tablet 6 addresses this directly. Marduk speaks to the assembly. "Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Truly, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." The gods rejoice. They offer to help, and they do so by sacrificing Kingu, the rebel leader who had sided with Tiamat. From his blood, mixed with clay, Ea creates humanity. Out of his blood they fashion mankind. He imposed the service and let free the gods. Humanity was created to perform the service the gods no longer wanted to perform themselves. Physical labour, temple maintenance, offerings, the work of keeping civilization operational. But notice the theology here. Humanity is created from the blood of a rebel god. This means humans have divine essence within them, consciousness, intelligence, will. But that divine essence is rebel essence. Humanity is capable of following divine instruction, but also capable of choosing independence, of questioning, of asserting autonomy. This theological claim is crucial for understanding what happens next in the epic. After humanity is created and set to work, the gods build Babylon as Marduk's city. They construct Esagila, his temple. They establish the infrastructure of worship. And then, in Tablet 7, something remarkable happens. The divine assembly gathers and confers upon Marduk 50 names. Each name represents an aspect of divine authority. Each name consolidates power that had previously been distributed among many gods. The tablet lists them systematically. Asuru, grantor of cultivation. Asuru Alim, who makes decisions in the assembly. Asuru Alimna, who protects divine refugees. Tutu, who renews the sanctuaries. Ziukina, who establishes purity. Ziku, who creates life. Agaku, who makes sacred counsel. Tuku, who drives away enemies. Shazu, who knows hearts. Zisi, who reconciles disputes. The litany continues through 50 names, 50 functions, all now concentrated in Marduk as executive mediator between the divine realm and creation. This is organisational restructuring. Instead of multiple gods, each handling their own domain and requiring separate worship and separate offerings and separate priestly lines, everything flows through one central authority, one temple system, one priesthood, one bureaucratic structure. From humanity's perspective, this simplifies everything. Instead of navigating dozens of divine personalities, temperaments and requirements, there's one channel, one protocol, one set of procedures. But it also means something else. The many gods who once interacted directly with humanity have delegated their authority. They've stepped back. They're still present in the cosmic structure, the names prove they exist, and their functions continue, but they operate through Marduk now, through his priesthood, through his temple, through the system he oversees. This is the theology of delegated authority. The gods still care about cosmic order, they still reward justice and punish chaos, but they've created a management structure, an institutional hierarchy, a chain of command that doesn't require every god to personally oversee every aspect of human civilization. And humanity's role in this structure? Service, yes, but service that maintains the system. Priests who perform rituals, administrators who keep records, labourers who maintain temples, farmers who provide offerings. A civilization that functions according to divine principles but operates through human agency. The Enuma Elish was recited during the Akitu festival, Babylon's New Year celebration. Every year, the epic was performed in the temple. Every year, the creation of humanity and the establishment of Marduk's authority were ritually reenacted. Every year, the cosmic order was symbolically renewed. Why? Because cosmic order isn't automatic. It requires maintenance, active participation, humanity performing its assigned role within the structure Marduk established. This is contract theology, agreement, obligation, divine and human working within an established framework. The gods provide the structure, set the principles, grant authority to human kings and priests to administer civilization according to those principles. Humanity provides the labour, the offerings, the active maintenance of temples and cities and irrigation and agriculture and law. Both parties have responsibilities. Both parties benefit. And as long as both parties uphold their end, the system works. But what happens when one party defaults? The Enuma Elish doesn't address that question directly. It ends with cosmic order established and humanity in its place. But other texts do address it. Texts that describe what happens when the contract breaks, when cities fall into chaos, when temples are abandoned, when offerings cease, when the gods withdraw their presence. These are the lamentation texts, and they provide another angle on the final message, because in them we see the consequences of forgetting the inheritance, of failing to maintain what was given. The cities that wept. The University of Pennsylvania Museum houses multiple tablets from Nippur containing one of the most haunting genres in ancient literature, city lamentations. These aren't mythological fantasies, they're historical documents describing real catastrophes, the fall of cities, the abandonment of temples, the physical departure of gods from their sacred dwellings. The Lament for Ur is the most complete example. Multiple copies. Old Babylonian period, around 2000 BC, describing events from approximately 2004 BC when Ur fell to the Elamites. The text spans 11 sections across multiple tablets. It's written as ritual lamentation, meant to be recited by gala priests during temple mourning ceremonies. The text begins with a divine assembly scene. The gods Anu and Enlil have decreed that Ur must fall. Nana, the moon god, who is Uri's patron deity, pleads for his city. He argues. He begs. He reminds the assembly of Uri's faithfulness, its offerings, its temples, its piety. The text records his desperate speech. O Father Anu, don't let that city be destroyed. O Father Enlil, don't let its people perish. But the decree stands. Anu and Enlil have made their decision. The text explicitly states that the destruction is divine will, not merely military conquest. The Elamites are the instrument, but the gods are the cause. What follows is devastating. Nana, Ur's patron god, abandons his temple. The text describes this in physical terms. Nana stood aside from his beloved house. He left the sheepfold, the sacred dwelling place. His wife Ningal, like a flying bird, left her home. The purification rituals ceased. The divine decrees were altered. The temple stood silent. The gods have physically left. The temple remains as a building, but it's empty. No presence. No divine inhabitant. The rituals continue mechanically, priests going through motions, but the power that made them effective is gone. Then the catastrophe unfolds. The Elamites attack. Ur's walls are breached. The city burns. The text describes corpses in the streets, survivors fleeing, temples desecrated, sacred groves cut down, canals filled with bodies. It's historical description, archaeological event, but filtered through theological lens. This happened because the gods withdrew their protection. But why? Why did Anu and Enlil decree Ur's destruction? The text gives hints, references to rituals neglected, offerings delayed, pride, assumption that past faithfulness guaranteed future favour, the kind of institutional decay that happens when inheritance is taken for granted, when the maintained becomes maintenance neglected. The lament for Ur served a specific purpose. It was recited during the rebuilding period. After the catastrophe, when survivors returned and began reconstruction, priests would perform this lamentation ritually. Why? To acknowledge what had been lost, to confess the failure, to appeal for divine return. And crucially, to document the lesson, the gods granted us cities, temples, irrigation, civilization. But their presence isn't guaranteed. It must be earned through proper maintenance, through upholding obligations, through remembering the contract. This isn't a one-time literary event. We have multiple city lamentations. Lament for Nippur, lament for Eridu, lament for Uruk, the curse of a god. Each describes similar pattern: divine decision, divine departure, physical catastrophe, ritual mourning, appeal for return. The lament for Nippur, preserved on tablet CBS 13856 at the Penn Museum, follows similar structure. Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, home of Enlil's primary temple, the Ekur. Even this city, maybe especially this city, experienced divine abandonment. After the storm, after the devastation, after Enlil's word had been fulfilled, after the city was turned to ruins, after its people were dispersed, the lady, like a flying bird, left her city. Ninlil, the mistress of Nippur, left her house. Note the progression. First Enlil's word, his decree, then the physical events, the storm, the devastation, the ruin, and only after the physical destruction do the gods depart, as if their departure is response to catastrophe, not cause, as if they're saying, we gave you this city, you failed to maintain it, now we're leaving. The curse of a god provides an even more explicit theological framework. This text, composed around 2000 BC, describes the fall of Akkad, the capital of Sargon's empire that collapsed around 2190 BC. The text blames King Naram-Sin for the catastrophe. According to the text, Naram-Sin became arrogant. He attacked the Ekur, Enlil's temple in Nippur. He desecrated the sacred precinct. He treated divine property as if it were his own. This was the ultimate violation, the human king, who held delegated authority from the gods, acting as if that authority were inherent, as if he owned what was merely entrusted to him. Enlil's response was devastating. He decreed that Akkad would fall, but not directly. He called upon the Gutians, a mountain people, to invade. The text describes the invasion in apocalyptic terms. On Agaday, instead of its sweet flowing water, there flowed bitter water. Who said I would dwell in that city? found not a good dwelling place. Who said I would lie down in Agaday found not a good sleeping place. The city became uninhabitable, not immediately destroyed, but gradually abandoned, infrastructure failing, water sources contaminated, social order collapsing. And the gods? They withdrew, all of them. The text lists them systematically. Inanna took away her radiance from the city. She withdrew her divine protection. Enki withdrew his wisdom. Ninhursag withdrew her fertility. Utu withdrew his justice. Ninurta withdrew his strength, each god removing their specific gift, each domain of divine blessing being withdrawn, leaving Akkad with physical structures but no animating power, buildings without purpose, temples without presence, a civilization stripped of what made it functional. And then the curse. Multiple gods pronounced judgment. Enlil pronounced, "City, you pounced on the echo like a lion, you destroyed it like a storm. For this your walls shall be torn down, your people shall be scattered, your name shall be forgotten, your kingship shall be taken from you. You shall become a ruin, a desolation, a warning." The city as warning, as object lesson, as documented example of what happens when the contract is broken, when inherited authority is treated as owned power, when maintenance obligations are neglected. These lamentation texts were preserved, copied, taught in scribal schools, recited in temples for centuries after the events they described. Why? Because they documented pattern. They preserved institutional memory of what causes divine withdrawal. What happens when cities forget their stewards, not owners? When human authorities forget their power is delegated, not inherent? When civilization treats its inheritance as entitlement? The pattern across all these lamentations is consistent. Divine presence establishes a city. The city flourishes under divine favour. The city neglects its obligations or violates sacred boundaries. The divine assembly decrees judgment. The patron deity pleads, but is overruled. The deity physically departs from the temple. Physical catastrophe follows plague, environmental collapse. Survivors mourn and appeal for return. Restoration requires renewed commitment to proper maintenance. This is contract theology made explicit. The gods granted cities, they granted kingship, they granted civilization, but those grants come with terms. Violations trigger consequences, and the ultimate consequence is divine withdrawal. The lamentation texts suggest that divine departure isn't arbitrary, it's responsive. The gods leave when their terms aren't met, when temples aren't maintained, when justice isn't administered, when offerings cease, when pride replaces humility, when humans forget their stewards. But withdrawal isn't necessarily permanent. All the lamentation texts include appeals for return, rituals of restoration, renewed covenants, the possibility of divine presence returning if proper relationship is restored. This suggests something crucial about the final message before Exodus. If divine presence is conditional, if it depends on human maintenance of the inherited system, then the instructions for maintenance become the most important message of all. What were those instructions? What did the gods, through their priesthood, teach about maintaining civilization in their physical absence? To answer that, we need to look at one more set of texts. Texts that come not from kings or assembly decrees, but from the priesthood itself, from those who served as intermediaries, who preserved the knowledge, who maintained the connection even when direct presence had withdrawn. What the priestess preserved. In the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania, among thousands of cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, a particular collection stands out for its systematic nature. These are copies of the temple hymns, a series of 42 hymns dedicated to temples across Sumer and Akkad. Each hymn addresses a specific temple, its patron deity, its sacred city, its ritual significance. The collection is attributed to Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god Nanna at daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, who lived around 2300 BCE. Enheduanna is the first author in human history whose name we know. She signed her work. She claimed authorship. And scribes preserved her texts for over 1,000 years after her death, copying and recopying them as part of the standard literary curriculum. But the temple hymns aren't poetry for entertainment. They're institutional documentation, a catalogue, an inventory of the sacred infrastructure of Mesopotamian civilization. Each hymn follows a similar pattern, identifies the temple location and architecture, names the patron deity, describes the ritual functions performed there, lists the offerings required, explains the temple's relationship to cosmic order, affirms the deity's presence and power, hymn by hymn. Enheduanna creates a comprehensive map of divine presence in Mesopotamia. 42 temples, 42 points where heaven and earth intersect, 42 locations where the gods dwell, receive worship, and exercise authority. The first hymn addresses the temple at Eridu, the oldest sacred site, the city where, according to the king list, kingship first descended from heaven. House, established on the bank of Eridu, you are founded on the Abzu, the cosmic waters. Your foundation is the Abzu, 50 in number, and the Engur, 7 in number, a shrine which looks into the heart of the gods. Your prince, the prince who stands constant, Father Enki, the great lord, has erected a house in your precinct, O house, at your sacred place, the Abzu, green like a mountain. O Eridu, your shadow extends over the waves. This isn't flowery description, it's technical documentation. The temple is founded on the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater deep that Enki governs. The numbers, 50 and 7, likely refer to specific architectural or ritual elements. The temple looks into the heart of the gods, meaning it serves as an observation point, an interface, a location where divine will can be discerned. Each hymn contains similar specificity. Not just there's a temple here, but this is what it's built on, this is who dwells there, this is what happens there, this is how it connects to cosmic order. The hymn to the temple in where Enheduanna herself served, house that brings down the mountain by your great me, great mountain, living place of Nanna, dyes of abundance, magnificent place where Nanna comes to rest. Oekish Nagol, perfect in heavenly beauty, your prince, the princely one who brightens the darkness, the god of heaven and earth who determines the destinies, Father Nanna, has erected a house in your precinct, again technical language. The temple operates by me, divine principles or decrees. It's described as a living place and a dice, both suggesting its occupied space, residence, location of active divine presence. Nanna comes to rest there. It's his dwelling when he's present in the human realm. The hymn to Bad Tibera, house, good woman, inspiring great awe. At the edge of the shining heavens you have manifested your greatness. You are as great as the inside of heaven. House, wild cow with fierce horns, bellowing in battle. Your lady, the noble lady, Lady Inanna, who causes disturbance, has erected a house in your precinct. Different temple, different deity, different function. Inanna's temple at Bad Tibera is described in martial terms: horns, bellowing, battle. Because Inanna's domain includes war, conflict, transformation. The temple's architecture and ritual presumably reflect that function. What Enheduanna has created is a systematic catalogue of the infrastructure of divine presence in Mesopotamia. If you were training someone to maintain a civilization, if you were preparing for transition from direct oversight to human administration, this catalogue would be essential. Here's where the gods dwell. Here's what each location does. Here's how they fit together into cosmic order. Here's what must be maintained. This isn't arbitrary poetry. This is institutional documentation, the kind of catalogue you'd create if you were archiving a system, recording how it works, preserving the knowledge so it could be maintained after direct oversight ceased. And there's another layer. Enheduanna doesn't just catalogue temples, she documents relationships. how temples relate to each other, how deities share authority, how different locations serve different cosmic functions but integrate into one system. The hymn to Nippur, Enlil's primary temple, House of Enlil with lofty towers which can look upon the land, house whose fearfulness and radiance reach up to heaven, house in its high place which can determine the fate of the land, house, mountain founded on great powers, house whose divine powers cannot be matched. Nippur is described as central, as the point from which authority radiates, as the high place from which fate is determined. This matches historical reality. Nippur was never a political capital, but it remained the religious centre of Mesopotamia for millennia. The city that controlled Nippur had cosmic legitimacy, because that's where Enlil dwelt. Enheduanna's catalogue preserves this hierarchy. It documents the organisational structure of divine governance. Enlil at Nippur as executive authority, Enki at Eridu as wisdom and technical knowledge, Anu at Uruk as supreme but distant sovereignty, Inanna at various locations as transformative power, Nanna at Ur as cyclical order and time measurement, Utu at Lhasa and Sippar as justice and illumination. Each god has domain, each temple has function, and together they form integrated system. Cosmic government operating through physical infrastructure that requires human maintenance. This is why the temple hymns mattered, why they were preserved, why scribes copied them for 1,000 years, because they documented the system, the inheritance, what must be maintained if civilization is to continue functioning within divine order. Enheduanna's role as high priestess makes this even more significant. She wasn't distant observer, she was operator, she performed rituals, she maintained the Ur temple, she knew from direct experience what cosmic maintenance required, and she documented it. Her other major work, The Exaltation of Inanna, describes a personal crisis. She was exiled from Ur by a rival political faction, removed from her temple, separated from her priestly duties, and in her exile she composed a hymn of lamentation and appealed to Inanna for restoration. The text is remarkable because it describes what happens when priestly maintenance is interrupted. The temple still stands, the physical structure remains, but without the priestess performing her function, without the rituals being conducted properly, without the intermediary maintaining the connection, divine presence becomes uncertain. The system falters. Enheduanna was eventually restored. Her exile ended. She returned to Ur and resumed her duties, and she documented the whole experience as teaching, as example of what happens when maintenance breaks down and what's required to restore it. This personal crisis, preserved in first-person narrative, suggests something crucial. The priesthood understood their role as essential maintenance, not optional, not supplemental, essential. The gods had withdrawn from walking among humans, but they still inhabited their temples, and that inhabitation required active human participation. Rituals performed correctly, offerings made consistently, sacred spaces maintained properly, knowledge preserved accurately. The priestly class was the interface, the connection point, the operational staff of cosmic order, and Enheduanna, as the first named author in history, documented their role for posterity, not as power grab, not as political authority, as maintenance responsibility, as inheritance obligation. Her temple hymns created the manual. Here's the system. Here's where each piece is. Here's what each does. Here's how it fits together. Maintain it. All of it. Every temple, every ritual, every offering, every connection point between human and divine. Because if any node in the network fails, the whole system is compromised. If temples are abandoned, rituals neglected, offerings ceased, knowledge lost, then divine presence withdraws, not as punishment necessarily, but as natural consequence. The interface ceases to function, the connection degrades. What was living becomes mechanical, what was presence becomes memory. This is the inheritance Enheduanna documented, not just temples as buildings, not just rituals as procedures, but the living system of divine human interface that made Mesopotamian civilization function. That gave it order, stability, cosmic legitimacy, divine favour. And the fact that she documented it systematically, comprehensively, in texts preserved for 1,000 years, suggests this was intentional knowledge transfer, preservation for posterity, teaching for those who would come after, instructions for maintaining the inheritance. But documentation isn't enough. Catalogue alone doesn't ensure understanding. For that, you need teaching materials, training protocols, worked examples showing how to apply principles to problems, how to solve issues without divine intervention, how to maintain systems through human wisdom operating within divine framework. That's what the next set of texts provides. Not lists and catalogues, but case studies, problem-solving procedures, worked examples of divine-human collaboration that model how the system should operate even when direct divine oversight has withdrawn. The protocols of continuity. Among the texts excavated from old Babylonian sites, a particular composition appears repeatedly in scribal libraries, Enki and Ninmah. Multiple copies. Standard curriculum. The text is structured as a myth, a story of the gods, but it functions as something else. It's a teaching manual, a worked example of problem-solving methodology. The text begins with a familiar scenario. The Anunnaki gods are exhausted from physical labour. They complain to Nama, the primordial mother goddess. She brings the complaint to Enki, who is sleeping in the deep. She wakes him. He responds with a solution: create workers to relieve the god's burden. But the story doesn't focus on the creation itself. It focuses on what happens afterward, on the testing, on what happens when the creation doesn't work as planned. Enki creates the first humans successfully. They function, they work. But then Ninmah, the mother goddess, challenges him to a competition, a test of wisdom. She proposes, I will distort the human form. You must find a use for what I create. This is where the text becomes instruction. Ninmah creates a man who cannot hold back his urine. Enki's response, I will appoint him as a chamberlain. He shall serve the king, standing always at attention, because his condition prevents him from sleeping on duty. Ninmah creates a woman who cannot give birth. Enki's response, I will assign her to the queen's household as a weaving supervisor. She will not be distracted by children and can focus entirely on her craft. Ninmah creates a man with neither penis nor vagina. Enki's response, I will make this person a courtier and advisor. Freed from sexual desire and reproductive obligation, they will think clearly and serve as trusted counsel. She creates a man who cannot walk. Enki assigns him as a silversmith, a seated profession requiring fine motor skills but no mobility. She creates a man who cannot control his speech. Enki makes him a singer. His verbal impairment becomes rhythmic expression in music. The pattern continues. Each defect becomes an opportunity. Each limitation is reframed as specialization. Each problem is solved by finding the right role within the system rather than by changing the person to fit an ideal. This is teaching problem-solving methodology. Specifically, when faced with something that doesn't meet specifications, don't discard it. Find where it fits. Recognize that systems need diversity of function, that limitations in one domain often accompany strengths in another. That wisdom lies in appropriate placement, not in forcing conformity. Then Enki reverses the challenge. He creates a being so afflicted that Ninmah cannot find a place for it. A creature unable to eat, unable to stand, unable to communicate, unable to perform any function. Ninmah tries repeatedly to find a role but fails. Enki's point, there are limits. Not everything can be accommodated. Some problems don't have solutions within the system. The wise administrator recognizes boundaries, knows when to accommodate and when to acknowledge limitation. The text ends with Ninmah conceding defeat and praising Enki's wisdom. But the real conclusion isn't about competition. It's about the methodology now established. The protocol for problem solving. Assess the actual characteristics of what you're working with. Identify strengths even in apparent weaknesses. find appropriate placement within the system, recognize legitimate boundaries while maximizing potential, accept that some problems have no solution, and wisdom includes knowing the difference. This is teaching autonomous decision making, teaching humans how to solve problems the way Enki would solve them, not by constantly appealing to divine intervention, but by applying divine wisdom to human circumstances. The text was standard curriculum. Students copied it, memorized it, internalized the methodology, and then when they became administrators, judges, temple managers, estate supervisors, when they faced actual problems requiring actual decisions, they had a model, a protocol, a way to think through issues using wisdom principles rather than waiting for divine command. This is what inheritance includes. Not just receiving systems, but receiving the wisdom to maintain them, the methodology to solve problems within them, the principles to guide decisions about them. Another text in the same tradition, Enki and Ninhursag, follows similar structure. The gods are in Dilmun, the paradise, the pure place. But Dilmun lacks fresh water. It can't support life. Enki is asked to solve the problem. He doesn't create water magically. He teaches hydrology. He shows how to dig channels from the underground aquifer, how to bring the water to the surface, how to create irrigation systems that distribute it across the land. The text describes the technical process in detail. Then plants grow. But some are poisonous. The goddess Ninhursag creates 8 specific plants in the garden. Enki, curious, tastes each one. Some make him sick. He develops 8 different ailments from the 8 plants. Ninhursag heals him by creating 8 healing goddesses, one for each ailment. Each goddess corresponds to the part of the body affected. Each represents specialized medical knowledge. The text has been read as myth, as allegory, as poetry, but it functions as taxonomy. It categorizes plant types, diseases and cures. It creates a systematic framework for medical knowledge. And it models the methodology, observation Enki listing the plants, consequence, analysis identifying specific ailments, intervention Beshalizeful, and documentation which cure works for which ailment. This is teaching empirical methodology within theological framework. The gods establish the principles, the humans apply them. Through observation, experimentation, systematic record keeping, humans can solve medical problems without requiring divine intervention for each case. These texts, Enki and Ninmah, Enki and Ninhursag, and others in the same tradition, form a curriculum in autonomous problem solving. They model thinking, they demonstrate methodology, they show how to apply divine wisdom to human situations. And they do so by depicting the gods themselves engaged in the process. Enki doesn't simply decree solutions. He works through problems systematically. He experiments, he adapts, he finds what works. And by modelling this behaviour in texts that scribes copied and students memorised, the tradition ensures that human administrators would think the same way. This is inheritance at its deepest level. Not just receiving knowledge, but receiving the method to generate new knowledge when circumstances change. Not just inheriting solutions, but inheriting problem-solving capacity. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition preserved these texts alongside administrative records, legal codes, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, and mathematical tables, all of it treated as one integrated body of knowledge, all of it necessary for maintaining civilization. Because civilization isn't static, it faces new problems, unprecedented situations, challenges the ancestors didn't encounter. And if the only knowledge is what was explicitly taught, the system becomes brittle. It breaks when circumstances change. But if the inheritance includes methodology, how to think, how to analyse, how to solve, how to adapt, then the system is resilient. It can respond to novelty. It can evolve while maintaining core principles. This is what the Enki texts taught. This is what the priesthood preserved. And this is what suggests the final message wasn't a simple command or a list of rules. It was comprehensive knowledge transfer. Principles, procedures, methodology, examples, problems, solutions. Everything needed for humans to govern themselves within divine framework. But knowledge alone isn't enough. You also need tools, infrastructure, practical techniques that make the knowledge actionable. You need the technical capacity to implement wisdom. That's what the next category of texts provides. Not mythology, not theology, just technical documentation. The practical inheritance that made abstract wisdom concrete and actionable. Mathematics, medicine, and maps. The Yale Babylonian collection houses thousands of cuneiform tablets that never make it into popular discussions of ancient Mesopotamia. These aren't epic narratives or hymns to gods. They're technical documents, administrative records, and most importantly for our investigation, educational materials that taught practical skills necessary for civilization maintenance. Among them are mathematical tablets containing multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, square root approximations, and worked examples of geometric problems. These aren't theoretical mathematics. They're applied engineering, surveying, construction, resource distribution. The calculations needed to build temples, dig canals, distribute grain, levy taxes, and plan cities. One tablet, catalogued in the Yale collection, contains a problem about digging a canal. It gives the length, width and depth required, the number of workers available, and their daily output rate. The student's task: calculate how many days the project will take and how much food must be provisioned to feed the workers during construction. This is project management, infrastructure planning, the mathematics of civilization maintenance. Another tablet presents a problem about building a ramp to a temple platform. Given the height of the platform and the angle of incline that loaded carts can manage, calculate the length of the ramp and the volume of earth required to construct it. These problems weren't hypothetical. Mesopotamian ziggurats, stepped pyramid temples, had massive ramps for bringing offerings and building materials to the upper levels. The mathematics on these tablets represents actual engineering knowledge required for actual construction projects. The tablets also contain what we'd call business mathematics, compound interest calculations, profit margins on trade goods, conversion ratios between different units of measurement, exchange rates between silver, barley and wool, the three primary currencies of ancient Mesopotamia. One problem: a merchant invests X amount of silver in a trading voyage. The journey takes Y months. The return rate is Z. Calculate the profit and compare it to alternative investments over the same time period. This is teaching economic decision making, investment analysis, risk assessment, the same kind of thinking the instructions of Shurupak addressed philosophically, now given computational tools. The mathematical corpus wasn't just taught to temple scribes, it was standard education for administrators, merchants, surveyors, tax collectors, and estate managers. Anyone managing resources needed these tools, and the fact that the same problems appear in multiple copies across different sites and different time periods indicates standardized curricula, common training, shared technical foundation. This suggests institutional continuity, knowledge systematically preserved and transmitted, not left to chance or individual initiative, but embedded in educational infrastructure. The medical texts follow similar pattern. The Yale collection includes diagnostic and prescription tablets that read like procedural manuals. If a man's body is yellow, his face is yellow, and his eyes are yellow, this is the hand of the ghost of one who died of jaundice. To cure him, mix turtle shell, powdered copper, cas plant, and fermented beer. Let him drink it for 3 days. This is systematic medicine. Symptom observation, yellowing of skin and eyes. Diagnosis attributed to supernatural cause, but based on pattern recognition. Treatment protocol, specific recipe with specific dosage and duration. Another tablet: if a man's chest hurts when he breathes and he coughs up blood, this is consumption. Mix poppy, honey, and fat. Apply to the chest. Let him inhale the smoke of burning juniper 3 times daily. Respiratory disease, palliative care, pain management, smoke inhalation therapy that would have antimicrobial properties. The medical texts aren't magical incantations, though they often include ritual components. They're systematic documentation of observed correlations between symptoms and treatments. They represent accumulated experience, clinical knowledge preserved and transmitted. Some tablets include surgical procedures. To remove a stone from the bladder, make the man lie on his back. Have 4 assistants hold him still. Make an incision in the lower abdomen. Insert the bronze tool. Locate the stone by touch. Extract it. Pack the wound with wool soaked in oil. Bandage tightly. Change the dressing every 2 days until healing. This is operative technique. Surgical protocol. Step-by-step instruction that assumes the reader has anatomical knowledge and surgical experience, but needs standardized procedure. The fact that these texts exist suggests several things. First, surgery was being performed with enough frequency to warrant documentation. Second, there was a training pipeline, senior physicians teaching junior physicians using standardized texts. Third, the society valued empirical medical knowledge enough to invest substantial resources in preserving it. The astronomical texts are even more sophisticated. Multiple tablets from the Yale collection and other repositories contain observations of planetary positions, lunar eclipse predictions, and star catalogues that show extraordinary precision. The Enuma Anu Enlil series, a massive compendium of celestial omens spanning 70 tablets, represents centuries of systematic sky observation. Each tablet documents correlations between astronomical events and terrestrial outcomes, not because the Mesopotamians believed planets caused events directly, but because they believed cosmic order and earthly order were connected, that the same divine principles governed both, that by observing heaven you could discern patterns relevant to Earth. This is systematic data collection, pattern recognition, predictive modelling. The tablets don't just say, when Mars is in constellation X, bad things happen. They record, on date Y, Mars was in position Z, and event W occurred. Then on date Q, Mars was in similar position, and similar event occurred. After multiple observations establishing correlation, the pattern is documented as reliable enough for prediction. This is scientific methodology within theological framework. The gods established the celestial order. That order is regular and observable. By studying it systematically, humans can understand divine will without requiring direct revelation for each circumstance. The astronomical tablets also contain mathematical models, lunar cycle calculations accurate to within minutes across centuries, planetary position predictions, eclipse windows, the famous Babylonian System A and System B astronomical calculations, which use arithmetic sequences to model celestial motion, represent mathematical sophistication comparable to Greek astronomy a millennium later. Why did Mesopotamian scribes develop this level of astronomical sophistication? Multiple reasons. Practical, the calendar was based on lunar observation. An agricultural society required accurate seasonal prediction. Religious, celestial events were interpreted as divine communication, so accurate observation was theological necessity, but also intellectual inheritance. The tradition claimed the Apkallu, the 7 sages who taught civilization before the flood, brought astronomical knowledge, that the stars were mapped by divine wisdom before human observation began. The role of human astronomers was to maintain that knowledge, refine it, preserve it, transmit it. One text from the Library of Ashurbanipal makes this explicit. The wisdom that the Apkallu brought from before the flood, which Ea established, the wisdom of writing, mathematics, divination, and all crafts, I have studied and mastered. I have read the complex tablets. I have taken counsel with the tradition. I add my own observations to what was given. This is how inheritance works in practice. You receive foundational knowledge from the tradition. You master it. You apply it to current circumstances. You add your own observations and refinements. You pass it to the next generation. The knowledge grows, but remains rooted in the foundation. The technical texts, mathematical, medical, astronomical, administrative, represent the practical infrastructure of the inheritance. They're the tools that make wisdom actionable, the procedures that make principles effective, the documentation that makes transmission reliable. A civilization can have wise priests and just kings, but without the technical capacity to build temples, dig canals, heal disease, predict seasons and manage resources, it can't function. The practical inheritance was as essential as the spiritual inheritance, and the fact that both were preserved together, taught together, treated as integrated knowledge, suggests the Mesopotamian scribal tradition understood that civilization requires both. You need principles and procedures, wisdom and technique, divine framework and human skill. This comprehensive inheritance, theological, philosophical, procedural, technical, is what the Sumerian priesthood preserved, what they systematically taught to each generation, what they treated as sacred trust, not because it was religious in narrow sense, but because it was foundational. It was what made civilization possible. But inheritance always raises a question. What if it was received under false pretenses? What if the origin story is different than the tradition claims? What if we're interpreting metaphor as history, or history as metaphor? To address that question, we need to look at the flood narratives more carefully, at what they describe, at where they agree and where they differ, at whether they're documenting an event or creating an explanation. The moment of separation. Every major Mesopotamian literary tradition includes a flood narrative. The Eridu Genesis in Sumerian, the Atrahasis epic in Akkadian, Tablet C of the Gilgamesh epic, the Genesis account in Hebrew, which appears to draw from Mesopotamian sources. These texts tell similar stories with variations in detail, but they all mark the flood as the same thing, a boundary, a transition point, a before and after. The question isn't whether a catastrophic flood occurred. Evidence for major flooding in Mesopotamia appears in the archaeological record multiple times. The question is what the flood came to represent in institutional memory, why it became the marker for cosmic transition, why every version of the story describes the world before the flood as fundamentally different from the world after. The Eridu Genesis, our oldest complete version, is fragmentary but preserves the key elements. Before the flood, the text describes kingship descending from heaven to 5 cities, divine rule through human kings, direct governance, the antediluvian kings with their impossible reign lengths, then divine decision. The gods took counsel together. Anu, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag made a decision. They decreed that the flood would sweep over. The flood itself is described briefly. No extensive detail about the catastrophe. The focus is on preservation. Ziusudra, the king of Shuruppak, is warned by Enki. He builds a boat. He survives. And crucially, after the flood, he makes an offering to Anu and Enlil. The gods accept the offering. They grant Ziusudra eternal life, but he's exiled to Dilmun, the paradise, removed from human civilization. The text then states, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Again, that phrase, descended from heaven. As if kingship needed to be re-granted, re-established. Given again, but this time differently. The Atrahasis epic provides more context. In this version, the flood is explicitly the result of divine frustration with human population growth and noise. But after the flood, when the gods gather around Atrahasis' offering, they have what appears to be a policy discussion. Enlil, who decreed the flood, is confronted by Enki, who warned the human survivor. There's conflict in the divine council. Enlil is angry that his decree was circumvented, but the other gods are hungry, grateful for the offering, aware they need human service. What follows is negotiation, a new arrangement. The text is fragmentary here, but other sources help reconstruct what happened. The gods agree to maintain humanity, but with modifications. Human lifespan is reduced, making population growth less explosive. Women's fertility is made irregular, not all women can bear children, not all children survive, reproductive capacity varies, disease and hardship are introduced, natural mechanisms that limit population without requiring another flood. This is system redesign. The antediluvian setup, long-lived humans multiplying without constraint, proved unsustainable. The post-flood setup includes built-in population regulation. The system is redesigned for stability. But there's another change, less explicit but consistently present across all versions. The gods withdraw from direct presence. They remain in their temples, but they don't walk among humans as they did before. Communication becomes mediated through priests, through omens, through rituals, through dreams. The relationship becomes less direct, more formal, more institutional. Tablet C of the Gilgamesh epic, the Neo-Assyrian version from Ashurbanipal's library, provides the most detail about the flood itself, but also preserves this transition. Utnapishtim, the Babylonian name for the flood survivor, describes building the boat, loading it, surviving the flood, and making the offering. Then he recounts what the gods said to each other afterward. Ishtar, the Babylonian name for Inanna, speaks, "The gods should never again decree a flood to destroy humanity. If humans become too numerous or too problematic, let there be other means, predators, famine, plague. But not complete destruction." Enlil agrees, but with a condition: Utnapishtim and his wife will be granted immortality, but they must live far from humans. At the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, they become distant, mythical, unreachable. The flood survivors don't integrate back into human society. They're removed to sacred space. This is the pattern: survival and separation. The knowledge is preserved, but the direct connection is severed. The world continues, but the old way of being doesn't. The gods grant continuation, but establish distance. All the flood narratives agree on this structure: preservation of remnant, establishment of new terms, withdrawal of direct divine presence, transition from one mode of divine-human relationship to another. But why frame it as a flood specifically? Why not simply say the gods decided to withdraw from direct presence, and here's how things changed? One answer: because there was an actual catastrophic flood, or series of floods, that devastated Mesopotamian civilization at some point in antiquity. The archaeological site of Ur shows evidence of major flooding around 2900 BCE. Shuruppak, Eridu, and other early sites show flood layers. The Tigris and Euphrates flood unpredictably, and in a civilization dependent on irrigation agriculture and located on alluvial plains, catastrophic flooding would be civilizationally transformative. If such flooding destroyed cities, forced population movement, disrupted political systems, and required rebuilding, that would be precisely the kind of historical boundary that institutional memory would preserve. The before and after. The transition point when one era ended and another began. But there's another possibility that doesn't contradict the first. The flood narrative might preserve memory not just of physical disaster, but of systemic collapse, the end of an organizational structure, the fall of a governing institution, a transition from one kind of political and religious system to another, metaphorically described as a flood that swept away the old order. In this reading, the antediluvian system, direct divine rule through semi-divine kings, overseen by the Apkallu sages, operating with divine kings who lived impossibly long, represents a very different kind of civilization, one where authority was more centralized, more directly theocratic, perhaps more autocratic. And the flood represents the collapse of that system and its replacement with city-state autonomy, priestly mediation, and delegated authority. Whether physical flood, systemic collapse, or both, the narrative preserves the same institutional memory: there was a before. Then there was a catastrophic boundary. Then there was an after, and the after operates under different rules. The rules of the after are what matter for our investigation, because the after is the system the Sumerian priesthood maintained. The after is the inherited civilization they were responsible for. The after is what all the instructions, catalogues, wisdom texts and technical manuals were designed to maintain. And if the flood marked the transition from direct divine rule to delegated human governance within divine framework, then the final message before Exodus isn't a single dramatic speech. It's the comprehensive body of knowledge, procedures, principles and techniques that the divine assembly, working through the Apkallu, through Enki's wisdom, through the priesthood, ensured humanity possessed before withdrawing direct presence. The message was, here's how to maintain civilization. Here are the temples and their functions. Here are the principles of justice, agriculture, trade and governance. Here are the technical skills for construction, medicine, astronomy and mathematics. Here are the problem-solving methodologies. Here are the warnings about what causes divine withdrawal. Here are the protocols for maintaining connection through ritual, offering and proper conduct. Here, in other words, is everything you need. Now it's yours. Maintain it. We're stepping back, but we're not abandoning you. We're graduating from dependence to inheritance, from childhood to responsibility. That's not mythology. That's the logical conclusion of institutional analysis. If you take seriously the fact that the Sumerians treated these texts as records, preserved them as archives, taught them as essential curriculum, and structured their entire civilization around the belief that they were maintaining inherited systems, then the flood narrative preserves exactly what you'd expect: the documentation of transition from one governance model to another. And every text we've examined points to the same transition. King lists marking the boundary, wisdom literature teaching autonomous decision-making, temple catalogues documenting the infrastructure, technical manuals providing the tools, lamentation texts warning about failure, creation epics explaining delegated authority, problem-solving texts modelling methodology, all of it consistent, all of it pointing to the same pattern, all of it preserved by priests who believed they were maintaining memory, keeping alive the knowledge of how civilization came to be the way it is, what responsibilities it inherited, what obligations it must uphold. But can we trust that interpretation? Or are we reading meaning into texts that were never meant to be historical? To answer that, we need to step back, look at the pattern from a distance, see what the evidence suggests when we hold three interpretations in tension rather than choosing one prematurely, what the silence suggests. We've examined dozens of tablets now, real artefacts with catalogue numbers and museum locations, texts that scholars have translated, debated and contextualized for over a century. The Eridu Genesis from the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Atrahasis Epic from the British Museum, the Sumerian King List from the Ashmolean, the instructions of Shuruppak from Nippur, the lamentation texts, the temple hymns of Enheduanna, the creation epics, the Adapa myth and the Apkallu tradition, the technical manuals in mathematics, medicine and astronomy. All of these texts were preserved by Sumerian and Babylonian scribes who treated them as important enough to hand copy onto clay tablets, who included them in the standard curriculum, who archived them alongside administrative records and legal documents, who recopied them across centuries, sometimes with notations stating written according to its original, collated and checked the language of archival authentication. We need to ask, what do these texts taken together actually tell us? There are three major interpretive frameworks, and intellectual honesty requires we examine all three. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology. The mainstream scholarly position, these texts are theological literature, creation myths, foundation legends, sacred stories that explain cosmic order and human purpose within symbolic metaphorical frameworks. The gods aren't historical figures. The antediluvian kings aren't real people. The flood isn't a specific event. The Apkallu are mythological archetypes, not actual teachers. The numbers are symbolic, not chronological. In this reading, the Sumerians created these narratives to explain their world, to give divine sanction to their social structures, to provide cosmic legitimacy for their political systems. Kings claimed descent from gods to justify authority. Priests preserved myths to maintain institutional power. The narratives evolved over time as political circumstances changed. This interpretation has substantial support. We know religious institutions use mythology this way across cultures. We know origin stories often serve political functions. We know ancient peoples didn't distinguish between literal and metaphorical truth the way modern rationalism does. But this interpretation has to answer why the Sumerians treated these texts identically to their administrative records in terms of preservation and authentication, why they used the same archival standards for flood narratives as for grain distribution records, why they taught creation epics alongside mathematics as part of mandatory curriculum. If these were just stories, the institutional treatment doesn't match the content. Interpretation 2, Encoded Wisdom. An alternative reading, these texts are philosophical and spiritual teachings encoded in narrative form. The gods represent psychological principles, the flood represents spiritual transformation. The antediluvian period represents humanity's immature state. The post-flood period represents spiritual awakening. In this reading, Enki represents wisdom and compassion. Enlil represents law and judgment. Inanna represents transformative power. The divine assembly represents the integrated self making decisions. The flood represents ego death, transformation, rebirth. The inheritance represents spiritual knowledge passed from teacher to student. This interpretation recognizes symbolic depth while acknowledging the texts functioned as teaching materials. It explains why problem-solving methodology appears in mythological narratives, because the myths are vehicles for teaching wisdom principles. Multiple scholars have noted that initiation traditions across cultures use similar narrative structures. The hero must die to the old self, journey to the underworld, receive teaching, and return transformed. The flood narrative fits this pattern. Humanity before the flood is immature, dependent. Humanity after is responsible, autonomous. The journey through catastrophe is transformative initiation. But this interpretation also faces challenges. It has to explain why the texts include such specific detail, real cities, verified historical kings, precise technical instructions, authenticated astronomical data. If these were purely spiritual allegories, why embed them in verifiable historical and geographical contexts? Interpretation 3, preserved memory. The interpretation we've been exploring, these texts preserve institutional memory of an actual transition from one kind of civilization to another, from one system of governance to another, from direct divine rule, however we understand that phrase, to delegated human authority within established framework. In this reading, the antediluvian period represents a different organizational structure, perhaps a highly centralized theocratic state, perhaps a proto-civilization before Sumerian urbanization, perhaps something else entirely. The flood, whether literal catastrophe, systemic collapse, or both, marks the boundary when that system ended. The post-flood system is what we can verify archaeologically: autonomous city-states, priestly mediation, kings claiming divine mandate but not divine identity, sophisticated technical knowledge, systematic education, complex bureaucracy, Mesopotamian civilization as it actually existed in historical periods. The texts preserve memory of transition because that transition explains the current system. why kings need priestly legitimation, why temples require human maintenance, why civilization operates through delegation rather than direct divine administration, why technical knowledge must be preserved and transmitted rather than being innately known. This interpretation takes seriously the Sumerians' own claim that they were preserving records. It explains the archival treatment, the systematic preservation, the standardization across sites and centuries. It accounts for the mixture of verifiable detail and impossible claims by recognizing that distant memory becomes distorted over time. The essence remains true even as specific details become exaggerated or mythologized. But this interpretation faces the hardest challenge. It requires us to believe something extraordinary happened, something significant enough to be remembered across millennia, something that fundamentally restructured civilization. And it requires us to take seriously the possibility that ancient people's claims about their own history preserve actual historical memory, even when the details seem impossible. Which interpretation is correct? The honest answer, we don't know. And perhaps we can't know with the evidence available. Archaeological remains give us cities, temples, artifacts, but they don't directly verify theological claims. Texts give us narratives, but narratives are interpretable multiple ways. What we can say, the Sumerian scribal tradition treated these texts as important enough to preserve across centuries, important enough to include in mandatory education, important enough to authenticate and collate, important enough to rebuild library collections after catastrophes to ensure these specific texts survived. The texts themselves present consistent pattern across multiple genres, king lists, wisdom literature, creation epics, temple catalogues, lamentation texts, technical manuals, all describing the same transition from different angles, all marking the flood as boundary, all emphasizing human responsibility for maintaining inherited systems. The civilization that preserved these texts successfully maintained urban culture, written language, technical knowledge, and institutional continuity for over 3,000 years, longer than any other civilization in human history. That longevity suggests their system worked, that whatever they believed about the origins of their knowledge, their approach to preserving and transmitting it was effective, and the pattern they preserved, transition from dependence to inheritance, from direct rule to delegated authority, from constant intervention to established framework, from childhood to maturity, matches the pattern we see in every successful transfer of authority. Parents raise children not to remain dependent, but to become autonomous. Teachers educate students not to remain followers, but to become independent thinkers. Institutions train members not to replicate the past mechanically, but to apply inherited principles to new circumstances. If the flood narrative preserves memory of such a transition from a civilization where authority was more centralized and direct to one where authority was distributed and mediated, then it documents exactly what we'd expect. The transition required comprehensive knowledge transfer, systematic documentation, careful preservation, and ongoing education to maintain. The final message before Exodus in that reading isn't one text or one speech. It's the entire corpus of preserved knowledge, everything the priesthood maintained and transmitted, the full inheritance. But even if we prefer one of the other interpretations, even if we read these as pure mythology or encoded spiritual wisdom, the practical effect is the same. The Sumerian priesthood believed they were maintaining something essential. They invested enormous resources in preserving knowledge. They structured education around ensuring each generation received the inheritance. They treated preservation as sacred duty. And the civilization that resulted from that belief in inherited obligation, that sense of responsibility to maintain what was given, that systematic approach to knowledge preservation, that civilization invented writing, law, literature, mathematics, astronomy, urban planning, and institutional government. They created the foundation on which subsequent civilizations built. Whether the gods literally walked the earth and withdrew, or whether the Sumerians used divine imagery to explain the evolution of their institutions, or whether these texts encode spiritual transformation, the outcome is the same. A civilization that believed it had received something precious, that knew it must preserve that inheritance, that took seriously its obligation to maintain and transmit. That belief, that sense of responsibility, that systematic preservation, those are verifiable, those are documented in the tablets themselves, those are the foundation of everything that followed. And if we ask what message echoes across 4 millennia from those ancient priests who carefully pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, preserved the tablets through fire and flood and conquest and collapse, rebuilt libraries to ensure specific texts survived, the message is this: what you receive, maintain; what you inherit, honour; what you know, preserve; what you learn, transmit. Because civilization is not natural, it is built. And once built, it requires constant maintenance. Neglect brings collapse, abandonment brings loss. But faithful preservation, thoughtful adaptation, systematic transmission, these sustain what was given. These honour the inheritance. That message resonates regardless of how we interpret the theology. It resonates because it's true. Civilization does require maintenance. Knowledge does require preservation. Authority does require responsibility. Inheritance does require obligation. The Sumerian priests understood that. They documented it. They preserved the documentation. And 4,000 years later, we can read their tablets and see the same pattern they saw: transition, inheritance, obligation, maintenance. The silence of the gods, if we want to use that metaphor, isn't abandonment, it's graduation. The question isn't whether they left. The question is what they left behind. And more importantly, whether those who inherited have maintained the trust. The keepers of the record. The temperature in the University of Pennsylvania Museum vault is carefully controlled, humidity regulated, light exposure minimized. In climate-controlled cases, thousands of clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia rest on archival quality foam supports. Some are whole, many are fragmentary, all are carefully catalogued. CBS 1673, the Eridu Genesis fragment. The flood tablet from Nippur, still legible after nearly 4,000 years. The tablet weighs perhaps half a pound. It's roughly the size of an adult hand. The surface is covered in neat columns of cuneiform script. Each sign was pressed deliberately into the clay while it was still wet. Someone sat at a desk, or whatever the Sumerian equivalent was, with this tablet in front of them and a stylus in hand. They looked at an older copy of the text, and carefully, sign by sign, they reproduced it. This wasn't quick work. Cuneiform requires precision. Each sign is composed of multiple wedge strokes. Get the angle wrong, the depth wrong, the spacing wrong, and the sign becomes illegible or conveys different meaning. The scribe had to concentrate, had to check each line against the source, had to ensure accuracy, and when they finished, they set this tablet aside to dry. Maybe it was baked in a kiln for permanence. Maybe it was allowed to air dry and only accidentally fired later when the building burned during Nippur's destruction. Either way, it hardened, it lasted, it survived. Why did that scribe copy this text? It wasn't their composition. They were reproducing something older, something that existed in multiple copies, something that was part of the standard curriculum, something that someone, somewhere, long before, had decided must not be forgotten. That scribe was doing maintenance, preservation work, keeping alive a record that previous generations had determined was essential. And they weren't alone. Across Mesopotamia, in Uruk, in Babylon, in Nineveh, in Ashur, other scribes were copying the same texts, preserving the same traditions. maintaining the same archive, not because they expected fame or wealth for copying work, but because they believed it mattered. Because they understood their role, they were links in a chain of transmission that stretched back into antiquity and must continue into the future. They were temporary custodians of permanent knowledge. They were keepers of the record. What was in that record? Everything we've examined tonight. The king lists that documented transition, the wisdom instructions that taught autonomous decision-making, the creation epics that explained delegated authority, the lamentation texts that warned about divine withdrawal, the temple catalogues that mapped sacred infrastructure, the technical manuals that preserved practical skills, the problem-solving texts that modelled methodology, a comprehensive inheritance, everything needed to maintain civilization within divine framework, everything needed to operate autonomously while remaining aligned with cosmic order, everything needed to uphold the contract between human responsibility and divine favour. The scribes who preserved this weren't passive copyists. They were active participants in civilization maintenance. Without their work, the knowledge would have died, the techniques would have been lost, the principles would have been forgotten, the temples would have become empty ruins rather than living institutions. Civilization requires maintenance at every level. Farmers maintain fields, engineers maintain irrigation, priests maintain rituals, kings maintain justice, and scribes maintain memory, the knowledge of how it all works, the documentation of what must be done, the record of what happens when obligations are neglected. The Sumerian scribal tradition lasted 3,000 years, from the earliest pictographs around 3200 BC to the last cuneiform tablets in the 1st century C. 3 millennia of continuous knowledge transmission. That's longer than Christianity has existed, longer than Islam, longer than any other educational institution in human history. And throughout that entire span, certain texts remained in the curriculum: the king lists, the creation epics, the wisdom instructions, the flood narratives. Generation after generation of students learned the same traditions, copied the same texts, internalized the same principles. Why? Because those texts were foundational. They explained where civilization came from, how it was structured, what responsibilities it entailed. What happened when those responsibilities were abandoned? They weren't studying ancient history as academic curiosity. They were learning their civilization's operating manual, the institutional memory that made everything else possible. When Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king of the 7th century BC, ordered the creation of his library at Nineveh, he sent scribes across Mesopotamia to collect and copy texts. His goal was to assemble comprehensive knowledge, to ensure nothing important was lost. The library eventually held over 30,000 tablets covering every domain of learning, literature, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, law, ritual, history, divination and administration. Many of those tablets are now in the British Museum. When archaeologists excavated Nineveh in the 19th century and discovered Ashurbanipal's library, they found it methodically organised, texts grouped by subject, catalogues listing contents, colophons identifying scribes, dates, sources. This was institutional archive, serious preservation effort. And among those 30,000 tablets, significant space was devoted to the ancient Sumerian texts, the creation epics, the king lists, the flood narratives, the wisdom literature, texts already ancient when Ashurbanipal collected them, already traditional, already canonical. He preserved them because he understood their importance, because he recognized that these texts contained the foundational knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization, that they documented the inheritance, that they explained the obligations, that they preserved the principles by which legitimate authority operated. This is what inheritance looks like across time. Each generation receives knowledge from the previous generation, maintains it, adapts it to current circumstances, transmits it to the next generation. The knowledge evolves, but remains rooted in the foundation, and the foundation according to the Mesopotamian tradition, was the final message, the comprehensive knowledge transfer that happened at the threshold moment, when direct divine rule transitioned to human governance within divine framework, when the gods withdrew from walking among humans but left behind everything needed for civilization to continue. Whether we interpret that literally or metaphorically, the practical result is the same: a civilization that believed it had received precious knowledge, that knew it must preserve that knowledge, that structured its entire educational system around faithful transmission, that treated knowledge preservation as sacred duty. 4,000 years later, we can read their tablets, we can translate their language, we can understand their mathematics, we can follow their astronomical observations, we can study their legal codes, we can trace their historical records, because they preserved it, because the scribes did their job, because the chain of transmission held. That's not accident. That's intentional maintenance across millennia. That's institutional commitment to preservation. That's civilization taking seriously its obligation to inheritance. And perhaps that's the real final message. Not a dramatic speech by departing gods, not a single moment of cosmic instruction, but a principle embedded in practice. If you receive knowledge, preserve it. If you inherit wisdom, transmit it. If you're given responsibility, maintain it. If you're entrusted with civilization, honour that trust. The Sumerian priests who first preserved these texts in the 3rd millennium BC couldn't have known their tablets would still exist 4,000 years later. They couldn't have imagined we'd still be reading them, translating them, learning from them, but they did know this: their work mattered, the knowledge mattered, the preservation mattered, and future generations would need what they chose to maintain. They were right. The tablets endure. The knowledge persists. The principles remain relevant. Because maintenance works. Because preservation matters. Because inheritance requires obligation. Because civilization is built by those who came before and maintained by those who come after. The message echoes across millennia, not in dramatic proclamation, but in steady, faithful preservation, in scribe after scribe, copying the same texts, in library after library housing the same traditions, in generation after generation learning the same principles. The gods, if we want to use that framework, didn't abandon humanity. They graduated humanity from dependence to responsibility, from childhood to maturity, from receiving direct instruction to maintaining inherited wisdom. And the measure of whether the graduation was successful isn't whether humans remained as they were, it's whether they maintained what they received, whether they upheld the obligations, whether they honoured the inheritance. The Sumerian priesthood understood that. They documented it, they preserved the documentation, and left it for whoever would come after. The tablets remain. Silent now, the cuneiform signs pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. Silent, but still speaking, still teaching, still preserving the memory of when civilization transitioned from one kind of relationship with the divine to another. Still asking the question that every civilization must answer: will you maintain what you inherited? Will you preserve what you received? Will you transmit what you learned? The Sumerians said yes. For 3,000 years they said yes. The tablets prove it. What will we say? The question remains open. The inheritance continues. The responsibility persists. And somewhere in a museum vault, carefully preserved, temperature controlled, catalogued and protected, the tablets wait, ready for whoever seeks to understand, ready to teach whoever asks to learn, ready to remind whoever will listen. This is what you inherited. This is how it was maintained. This is what it requires. The final message before Exodus wasn't farewell. It was, you're ready. It's yours now. We've given you everything you need. Maintain it well. And then silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of trust. The silence that comes when the teacher steps back and lets the student demonstrate what they've learnt. The silence that asks, Will you honour what you received? The Sumerian priests heard that silence. They understood it. And they spent 3,000 years answering, yes, we will maintain it, we will preserve it, we will transmit it, we will honour the trust. The tablets are their answer, preserved across millennia, protected through conquest and collapse, maintained through dedication and discipline. An answer written in clay, fired into permanence, lasting long enough to teach us too, if we'll listen.